The handwritten note was tucked beneath the windshield wiper of my car, fluttering slightly in the autumn breeze outside the funeral home. I almost missed it as I fumbled for my keys, eyes still swollen from crying at my father's memorial service. "Gabby, I'm with Jenny now. I've moved my things to her place. Don't try to contact me, I'll have my lawyer reach out. I'm sorry it ended this way. Carlos." I stared at the paper, my husband's familiar handwriting suddenly looking alien, the casual cruelty of delivering this news while I was literally burying my father, making my knees buckle against the car door. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jenny. My best friend since college. The same Jenny who had texted earlier claiming she couldn't attend the funeral due to a sudden flu. The parking lot was emptying around me, relatives and friends departing with solemn waves, unaware that my world had just collapsed twice in one day. I smoothed the note between trembling fingers, a strange calm descending over me like a sheet of ice. Perhaps Carlos thought the shock of my father's death would numb the blow of his betrayal. Perhaps he and Jenny had timed this deliberately, assuming I'd be too devastated to think clearly. What they didn't know was that I had suspected something for months. What they couldn't have guessed was that my cousin Tony wasn't just a police detective. He was a private investigator who specialized in infidelity cases. And what they never imagined was that I had already documented everything. My name is Gabriela Morales, though everyone calls me Gabby. At 37, I never expected to lose my father to a sudden heart attack and my husband of 9 years to my best friend on the same day. But I also never expected to discover the strength that emerges when you have absolutely nothing left to lose. The first sign had appeared 4 months earlier, when Carlos began working late at his architectural firm 3 nights a week. After 8 years of predictable schedules and weekend planning, his calendar suddenly became erratic. Then came the new cologne, the password changes on his phone, the mysterious cash withdrawals from our joint account. "It's for a surprise for our anniversary," he'd said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes when I questioned a $2,000 withdrawal in May. By June, Jenny had started canceling our regular Wednesday coffee meetups, something we'd maintained religiously since moving to Denver 5 years ago. "The firm is crazy busy with the new downtown development," she'd text, always with too many exclamation points. "Rain check for next week." Jenny worked as an interior designer who often collaborated with Carlos's firm. I'd introduced them myself. I'm not naturally suspicious. As a pediatric oncology nurse, I've built my career on compassion and giving people the benefit of the doubt. But I'm also trained to notice patterns, to observe small changes that others might miss. The weekend, Carlos claimed to be at a conference in Phoenix, but had no hotel receipt. The night, Jenny posted a photo of her quiet evening at home, with a wine glass that I recognized from our own kitchen cabinet. The text messages that Carlos would immediately delete when I entered the room. My father had been the first to notice something was wrong. "Mija, that husband of yours is acting strange," he'd said during our weekly dinner at his house in early July. "He seems distracted, nervous." Dad had always been perceptive, a trait honed during his 30 years as a high school counselor. When I confided my suspicions, he'd suggested I talk to my cousin Tony. "No accusations, no confrontations," Tony had advised when I called him, his voice carrying the weight of hundreds of similar cases. "Just observe and document everything. If there's nothing going on, no harm done. If there is..." He'd paused. Then, "Well, you'll want evidence before you make any moves." So I began keeping a log. Dates, times, inconsistencies in Carlos's stories. I photographed bank statements showing unusual purchases and withdrawals. I noted how often Jenny's name came up in conversation, and how Carlos would grow defensive when I suggested inviting her and her husband Hank over for dinner. "They're having problems," he'd said dismissively in August. "Hank's thinking of moving. Out. A week later, Jenny had called me in tears, confirming that Hank had indeed left. I'd spent hours consoling her, offering to come over with ice cream and wine, an offer she'd quickly declined. "I just need some space right now," she'd insisted. By September, I had enough circumstantial evidence to justify the next step. With Tony's guidance, I'd installed a simple tracking app on our shared iPad, the one Carlos often used for showing clients his portfolios. It synced his text messages from his phone, storing them even when he deleted them from his device. I wasn't proud of this invasion of privacy, but as Tony reminded me, "You're not looking for embarrassing secrets, Gabby. You're protecting yourself from potential betrayal." The texts between Carlos and Jenny began innocuously enough, work-related exchanges about client preferences and meeting schedules. But by early October, they'd evolved into something undeniably intimate. "I hate lying to her," Jenny had written, one night while I was working a late shift at the children's hospital. "It won't be for much longer," Carlos had replied. "After her father's situation resolves, we'll tell her everything. She'll be devastated either way." My father had been diagnosed with coronary artery blockage in August, scheduled for bypass surgery in November. Carlos and Jenny had been discussing him as though his condition was terminal, as though they were simply waiting for the most convenient time to blow up my life. When Dad collapsed in his garden on a sunny Sunday morning, in October, the call from my mother had sent me rushing to the hospital, desperately messaging Carlos to meet me there. "In an important client meeting," he'd texted back. "Keep me posted." I later discovered, through the tracking app, that he'd been at Jenny's apartment when he sent that message, planning their future while my father's life slipped away in the emergency room. Standing in the funeral home parking lot, I smoothed the note again, folded it precisely, and placed it in my purse next to the thick envelope Tony had given me that morning before the service. "Just in case," he'd said, his detective's intuition apparently sensing that today might be the day everything came to a head. Inside the envelope was every text, every bank record, every piece of evidence documenting the calculated betrayal by the two people I had trusted most. I started my car, the familiar rumble providing an odd comfort in this newly unfamiliar world. My phone buzzed with a message from my mother. "Are you coming to the house? People are asking for you." I would go, of course. I would smile and accept condolences for my father. I would thank people for the casseroles and flowers. And I would say nothing about the note or what I knew. Not yet. As I pulled away from the funeral home, a strange sense of clarity cut through my grief. Carlos and Jenny had chosen the day of my greatest vulnerability to execute their plan, believing it would minimize my resistance. What they didn't realize was that in trying to break me completely, they had instead crystallized my resolve. I touched the envelope in my purse, its weight somehow reassuring. "Don't worry, Dad," I whispered to the empty car. "I won't let them get away with this." 3 days after my father's funeral, I sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by photo albums and the lingering scent of his favorite coffee. My mother moved quietly around us, organizing the casseroles and sympathy cards that had accumulated since the service. "Gabby, you should eat something," she said, placing a plate beside me. At 65, Phyllis Delgado remained the steady force she'd always been, practical, resilient, and perceptive. Even in her grief, she noticed everything. "I'm worried about you," she added, taking the seat across from me. "You've barely mentioned Carlos since the funeral, and I've called Jenny 3 times to check on you, but she isn't answering." I looked up from the photos of my father and me at my college graduation, his proud smile frozen in time. I hadn't told my mother about the note yet. Somehow, speaking it aloud would make it more real, adding to the burden she already carried. "Mom, there's something I need to tell you," I began, but was interrupted by a knock at the door. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My cousin Tony entered. Without waiting for an answer, as comfortable in this house as in his own. At 42, he carried himself with the confident alertness typical of his profession, though today he looked more like family than a detective, casual in jeans and a Denver Broncos sweatshirt, his dark hair slightly disheveled. "Tia Phyllis," he greeted my mother with a hug before turning to me with knowing eyes. "Gabby, we need to talk." My mother glanced between us, her expression sharpening. "What's happening? Is this about Carlos? He hasn't even called to check on you, Gabriella." "He's not going to call," I said quietly, finally ready to share the truth. I reached into my purse and handed her the note from the funeral. "He left this on my car. He's with Jenny now." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by my mother's sharp intake of breath. I watched comprehension dawn on her face, followed quickly by a flash of anger I rarely saw. "That coward," she whispered. "On the day we buried your father?" Tony pulled up a chair, his face grim. "It gets worse, Tia. They've been planning this for months. Gabby asked me to look into some suspicious behavior a while back." I nodded, gathering strength from their presence. "I'm a pediatric oncology nurse at Denver Children's. I've spent the last 9 years helping children fight for their lives, sitting with parents during their darkest moments. I know how to stay calm in a crisis, how to focus on what needs to be done rather than falling apart." Tony placed a supportive hand on my shoulder. "Gabby's not just any nurse. She runs the adolescent oncology unit. The hospital administrator told me once that she has the highest patient satisfaction scores in the region. Kids fighting cancer need someone special, someone who can be honest without destroying hope." My mother's eyes softened with pride despite her distress. "She gets that from her father." Dad had been my hero, the high school counselor who'd changed countless lives with his patient wisdom, who'd taught me that true strength came from compassion, not dominance. We'd been extraordinarily close, especially after I moved back to Denver from Chicago, where I'd met Carlos during my nursing residency. "Carlos and I seemed perfect on paper," I continued, needing them to understand the full picture. "He was ambitious but kind, or so I thought. When his firm opened a Denver office 5 years ago, I was thrilled to move back home, to be closer to you both. Jenny had moved here just a year earlier, and it felt like everything was falling into place." I pulled out a photo from the album, the 4 of us at a Rockies game, Carlos's arm around me, Jenny and Hank beside us, all smiling beneath the Colorado sunshine. Jenny was my rock through nursing school. We were roommates for 3 years in Chicago. She was maid of honor at my wedding. My voice caught slightly. "She helped me decorate our house. She was the first person I called when Dad got his diagnosis." Tony cleared his throat. "Jenny's husband Hank contacted me last week. He's suspected something for months but didn't have proof. He and Jenny separated 6 weeks ago, supposedly to work on themselves. He's been staying with his brother in Boulder." My mother shook her head slowly. "All this deception while your father was ill. How could they?" The question hung in the air as I stood to make more coffee, the familiar routine providing momentary comfort. Our kitchen, my childhood kitchen, had always been the heart of our family, where we'd celebrated victories and weathered disappointments together. The house in Lakewood was modest, but warm, filled with decades of memories. Unlike Carlos's sleek, downtown condo where we'd lived for the past 5 years, I'd always felt slightly out of place there, among the minimalist furniture and abstract art he'd insisted upon. Our wedding photos were displayed prominently, but somehow the space never quite felt like ours, like mine. "Carlos changed after his promotion to partner last year," I said, returning with fresh coffee. "The late nights started gradually, the secretive phone calls, the weekends suddenly booked with client emergencies." "Classic patterns," Tony confirmed. "I've seen it hundreds of times. Success changes people, or maybe it just reveals who they really are." My mother reached for my hand across the table. "What will you do now, mija?" Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with a text notification. Carlos. We need to talk about arrangements. I'll be collecting the rest of my things tomorrow at 10. Jenny's brother Glenn will be with me. I showed the message to Tony, whose expression darkened. Interesting that he's bringing backup. Almost like he's expecting trouble. He should be, my mother muttered, a flash of her Puerto Rican temper showing through her usually calm demeanor. I felt strangely detached reading his message, as though it were about strangers rather than my own life imploding. Perhaps it was the nurse in me, the professional distance I'd learned to maintain during crisis situations. Or perhaps it was because, beneath the shock and grief, a small part of me felt relieved. The months of suspicion and anxiety were over. The truth, however painful, was finally in the open. I won't be home at 10, I said decisively. I have an appointment with a lawyer at 9:30. Attorney Gianna Martinez. She specializes in high-conflict divorces. Tony recommended her. Tony nodded approvingly. Gianna doesn't play games. She'll help. You protect what's yours. My mother stood suddenly, her face resolute. You'll stay here with me. This was your home long before you met Carlos. It's still your home now. As she hugged me, I felt the first genuine sense of security I'd experienced in months. My life had unraveled in ways I never imagined possible, but I wasn't facing it alone. I had my mother's strength, Tony's expertise, and something else. Growing determination that had awakened inside me since reading that note in the funeral home parking lot. Carlos and Jenny had chosen the worst possible moment to reveal their betrayal, thinking grief would weaken me. Instead, it had clarified everything. When you've just watched your father take his last breath, the thought of fighting for what's rightfully yours doesn't seem so daunting anymore. Tomorrow, I said quietly, we start fighting back. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, autumn sunlight streaming through my childhood bedroom window. I'd barely slept, my mind racing through memories, searching for signs I might have missed. The digital clock on the nightstand showed 6:17 a.m., too early for my appointment with Gianna Martinez, but too late to fall back asleep. I reached for my phone and opened the folder Tony had helped me create months ago, labeled simply Documentation. The first entry was dated May 12th, a Tuesday when Carlos had claimed to be working late, but his firm's security log showed he'd left at 5:43 p.m. I remembered that evening clearly. I'd called him around 7:30, and he'd answered with ambient office noise playing in the background. A carefully constructed illusion. Entry after entry followed the same pattern: discrepancies in his schedule, unexplained expenses, weekend conferences with no corresponding hotel receipts. Small lies that seemed insignificant in isolation but formed a damning pattern when viewed together. I scrolled to June 24th, the day I'd first noticed Jenny's behavior changing. We'd planned our usual Wednesday lunch at Rosita's, the Mexican restaurant halfway between the hospital and her design studio. She'd canceled 30 minutes before, claiming a client emergency. Later that evening, I'd seen her Instagram story, a close-up of a margarita glass with the caption, "Much-needed midweek treat." The distinctive blue rim of the glass belonged to Azure, an upscale restaurant near Carlos's office. Another entry from July 8th. Carlos had fallen asleep on the couch, his phone unlocked beside him. Against my better judgment, I'd looked through his texts. The most recent exchange with Jenny had been deleted, but notifications were still visible on his screen. Can't wait for tomorrow. Same time? By August, the entries became more frequent, more specific. Carlos changing our joint account password. Jenny suddenly unavailable for our monthly girls' night for the first time in 5 years. The strange credit card charge from a jewelry store Carlos had never mentioned. The weekend Carlos claimed to be visiting his college roommate in Aspen, the same weekend Jenny told me she was attending a design conference in Vail, towns less than 40 miles apart. The final entry was from October 1st. Just 10 days before my father's death. A transcript of texts between Carlos and Jenny, captured by the tracking app Tony had helped me install. Jenny: I'm worried about Gabby. Her dad isn't doing well. Carlos: I know. Bad timing for everything. Jenny: Maybe we should wait until after. Carlos: We've waited long enough. Once this is over, we'll tell her together. It's going to hurt her no matter when we do it. I closed the folder, a hollow feeling in my stomach. They had been discussing my father's health as though it were an inconvenient obstacle to their happiness, waiting for the right moment to break my heart. Downstairs, I found my mother already awake, methodically kneading dough at the kitchen counter. Baking had always been her response to stress. The more elaborate the recipe, the greater her distress. Cinnamon rolls, she explained without looking up. Your father always said they could fix anything. I smiled despite myself, pouring coffee into my father's favorite mug, a ceramic monstrosity from his alma mater, chipped at the rim but never replaced. Not everything, Mom. She nodded, acknowledging the limits of even the best cinnamon rolls. Your lawyer called. She can meet you at 8:30 instead of 9:30 if that works better. It does. I want to be finished before Carlos shows up at the condo. I hesitated, then added, I'm thinking of letting him take whatever he wants. Furniture, electronics, it's all just stuff. My mother stopped kneading, fixing me with a sharp look. Your father didn't raise you to be a doormat, Gabriella. That stuff represents years of your life, your work, your savings. I know, but no buts, she interrupted. Carlos didn't just betray you with your best friend. He did it in the most cowardly way possible, hiding behind your grief. He doesn't deserve your generosity. Before I could respond, Tony arrived, carrying a leather portfolio and a tray of coffee. Brought reinforcements, he announced, setting everything on the table. Gianna's office confirmed 8:30. I'll drive you. He opened the portfolio, revealing printed copies of everything in my digital folder, plus additional documents I hadn't seen before. Bank statements from accounts you didn't know about, he explained, noting my confusion. Carlos opened a separate account in August. Been transferring. Funds incrementally? The statement showed regular deposits of $2,000, $3,000 over the past 2 months, small enough to avoid immediate notice, but substantial in aggregate. Nearly $27,000 had been diverted from our joint savings. How did you get this? I asked, my nursing ethics momentarily concerned about the legality of such information. Hank, Tony replied simply. Jenny's laptop had their banking passwords saved. He found the statements while looking for evidence of their affair. Legally obtained by a spouse with shared property rights. My mother set a plate of still warm cinnamon rolls between us. Eat something before your meeting. Both of you. As we ate, Tony explained what to expect from the initial consultation with Gianna. She's thorough, direct, and doesn't sugarcoat things. First session is about gathering facts and establishing goals. My goal is simple, I said, surprised by the firmness in my voice. I want what's fairly mine, nothing more, nothing less. Tony nodded approvingly. That's the right approach. By the way, I've arranged for a locksmith to meet us at your condo after the consultation. We're changing the locks. Can we do that? I asked. Legally, I mean. You're still the legal resident. Carlos abandoned the property. His note confirms that. We document everything, inform him of the change through proper channels, and establish a supervised time for him to collect pre-approved belongings. I felt a flicker of satisfaction at the thought of Carlos and Glenn arriving to find themselves locked out. It wasn't vindictive exactly, more like the first step in reclaiming control. My phone buzzed with a text from an unfamiliar number. Gabby, it's Hank. Can we talk? Jenny's husband had been surprisingly absent from my thoughts, another casualty in Carlos and Jenny's selfish choices. I should meet with him, I told Tony, showing him the message. After the lawyer, he advised. Don't have any undocumented conversations with anyone connected to the situation. As we prepared to leave, my mother handed me a small velvet pouch. Your father wanted you to have this, she said softly. I was saving it for the right moment. Inside was my grandmother's sapphire ring, a family heirloom Dad had often mentioned would someday be mine. He had it sized for you last month, Mom explained. Said he didn't want to wait for the someday that might never come. The simple band with its deep blue stones slid perfectly onto my right hand, a tangible connection to my father, to my heritage, to the person I was before Carlos's betrayal. Looking at it caught the sunlight, I felt a sudden certainty. I'm ready, I told Tony, gathering the documents. The woman who had stood paralyzed in the funeral home parking lot 3 days ago was receding, replaced by someone stronger, more resolved. As we drove to the lawyer's office, Denver's skyline came into view, the mountains beyond standing firm against the horizon. I thought about the pattern of deception I'd documented, the careful preparations Carlos and Jenny had made, their calculated timing. They had underestimated me completely. They still were. Gianna Martinez's office occupied the 12th floor of a glass tower in downtown Denver, with views of both the mountains and the city sprawl. The attorney herself was unexpectedly young, perhaps early 40s, with a sleek gray pantsuit and an air of focused efficiency that reminded me of senior surgeons at the hospital. Gabriella, she said, extending her hand. Tony's told me the basics. I'm sorry about your father, and about the circumstances bringing you here today. I appreciated her direct approach. No platitudes, no excessive sympathy, just acknowledgement and purpose. We settled into a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows, Tony placing our documentation folder in the center of the polished table. Before we begin, Gianna said, I need you to understand my approach. I don't focus on revenge or punishment. I focus on protection and fair division. My goal is to secure what you're legally entitled to while minimizing both emotional damage and unnecessary legal fees. Does that align with what you want? Completely, I replied. I don't want to destroy Carlos. I just want to protect myself. She nodded, opening the folder. Then let's establish the facts. You've been married 9 years, no children, joint ownership of your condominium, joint accounts, and separate retirement funds through your respective employers. Carlos has been diverting money to a separate account and is currently residing with your former friend Jenny, with whom he's been having an affair. He informed you of this through a note left on your vehicle during your father's funeral. She stated these painful facts with clinical precision, making them easier to process somehow. And this documentation, she continued, flipping through pages, shows a pattern of deception dating back approximately 6 months, financial irregularities, and text messages confirming premeditation. Yes, I confirmed. Everything's dated and organized chronologically. Gianna looked impressed. Most clients come to me with scattered memories and vague suspicions. This is exceptionally thorough. Gabby's methodical, Tony interjected. It's what makes her an excellent nurse. It will make her an excellent client as well, Gianna replied, pulling out a legal pad. Now, let's discuss immediate protective measures, then longer-term strategy. For the next hour, we outlined a comprehensive plan. First, securing the condominium and documenting all assets inside. Second, sending formal notice to Carlos prohibiting removal of anything beyond personal belongings without court approval. Third, freezing joint accounts and credit cards to prevent further financial drainage. What about the money he's already transferred? I asked. We'll address that in the divorce filing, Gianna explained. Colorado is an equitable distribution state, which means marital assets should be divided fairly, not necessarily equally, but fairly. His attempt to hide assets works against him. Judges take a dim view of such behavior. As we were wrapping up, Gianna handed me 3 documents to sign: a formal retention agreement, a petition for divorce citing irreconcilable differences, and a temporary restraining order prohibiting removal of marital assets. The TRO is preventative, she clarified, noting my hesitation. It doesn't suggest he's dangerous. It simply establishes legal protection for your shared property. I signed each document, my name looking strange and formal on the dotted lines. Gabriela Morales. Not Gabriela Vasquez, the name I'd carried for 9 years. This simple act, signing my maiden name, felt like reclaiming a piece of my identity. One last thing, Gianna said, sliding a business card across the table. This is Amy Rhodes, a forensic accountant I work with regularly. She'll help track down any additional accounts or assets Carlos might have hidden. By the time we left Gianna's office, it was nearly 10 a.m., the time Carlos had said he'd be at the condo. Tony drove us directly there, calling the locksmith to meet us. "Are you ready for this?" he asked as we pulled into the underground garage. He might still be there. I touched my grandmother's ring for reassurance. "I'm ready." The locksmith was waiting by the elevator, a burly man named Matthew with gentle eyes that belied his imposing frame. "Building manager's already approved the work," he explained as we rode up to the 14th floor. "Said to tell you he's sorry about your loss." Our condo door showed no signs of disturbance. Inside, however, was a different story. Dresser drawers hung open in the master bedroom, empty spaces on shelves where Carlos's books and trophies had been. In the walk-in closet, his clothes were gone, hangers scattered on the floor like skeletal remains. "He's already been here," I said, a strange mix of relief and anger washing over me. He didn't even wait until the time he told me. Tony immediately began taking photos, documenting the state of each room. This actually works in our favor. He entered without notice and removed items without supervision. Violation of standard marital property protocols during separation. Matthew got to work changing the locks while I wandered through the space that no longer felt like home. In the home office, Carlos's desk had been cleared of his laptop and files. On my desk, oddly enough, sat a small gift box with a card attached. "Don't open that," Tony warned, coming up behind me. "Not until we document it properly." He photographed the box from multiple angles, then carefully opened the card using a pen to avoid touching it directly. The handwriting was Jenny's, unmistakably loopy and artistic. "Gabby, I know nothing I say can make this better. What Carlos and I did was wrong. I've left some things that belong to you, photos from college, the bracelet you gave me for being your maid of honor, and the spare key to your condo. I'm so sorry about your dad. Please know I never meant to hurt you this way." "Jenny." Tony snorted in disgust. "The audacity, returning your own property as if it's some kind of peace offering." I stared at the box, remembering the silver friendship bracelet I'd given Jenny 9 years ago, engraved with our graduation date. The symbol of a bond I'd thought unbreakable. "Document everything in the box," I said, turning away. "I don't want to see it." Matthews finished with the locks, providing 3 new keys and detailed instructions for the building's electronic entry system. "All updated in the system," he confirmed. "Previous keys won't work anymore." Just as he was leaving, my phone rang. Carlos. Tony mouthed "speaker" and held up his own phone, ready to record. "Hello, Carlos," I answered, my voice steadier than I expected. "Gabby, where are you?" "I'm at the condo with Glenn. My key isn't working." His tone was irritated, entitled, as though I were inconveniencing him. "I've changed the locks, as is my legal right as the resident spouse. You abandoned the property, as stated in your note." "Abandoned?" "That's ridiculous. I just need to get the rest of my things." "According to my attorney, you've already removed items without notice or documentation. Any additional belongings will need to be collected under supervision, with an itemized list approved in advance." A pause, then. "You got a lawyer?" "Gabby, don't you think you're overreacting? This doesn't have to be hostile." The calm I'd maintained cracked slightly. "Overreacting? You left me a note during my father's funeral telling me you're with my best friend. How exactly should I be reacting, Carlos? Look, I know the timing was bad. The timing was deliberate, I interrupted. You and Jenny waited until I was at my most vulnerable. You thought grief would make me passive. You were wrong. Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice had hardened. So that's how it's going to be. Fine, you'll be hearing from my attorney. I look forward to it, I replied, ending the call before he could respond. Tony stopped his recording, looking impressed. Perfect. Calm, factual, and you got him to acknowledge the note and the timing. I sank onto the couch, suddenly exhausted. The confrontation had drained what little energy I had left after the emotional marathon of the past few days. What happens now? I asked. Now, Tony said, gathering our documentation. We continue building our case methodically. Carlos just showed his hand. He's going to claim you're being unreasonable, that this is all just a sad but normal breakup being complicated by your grief. I nodded, understanding the strategy taking shape. We weren't just protecting assets. We were establishing a narrative of calculated betrayal versus reasoned response. I need to get back to work next week, I said, thinking of my young patients at the hospital. I can't let this consume everything. That's exactly right, Tony agreed. Live your life, do your job, and let Gianna and me handle the legal maneuvers. The strongest position is one where you're moving forward while they're still trying to justify their past. As we prepared to leave, I took one last look around the condo. The space felt different now, less like a wound and more like a strategic position. Carlos and Jenny had made the first move in their betrayal, but in doing so, they'd revealed their character, and in the process, they'd revealed mine as well. The following week passed in a blur of legal paperwork, work shifts at the hospital, and nights spent at my mother's house going through my father's belongings. Each day brought new developments in what Tony had started calling the case. Carlos had indeed hired an attorney, an aggressive divorce lawyer named Bradford Wells, known for representing wealthy clients in contentious splits. His first official communication arrived via courier on Wednesday, a proposal that I vacate the condo within 30 days, accept a generous cash settlement of $50,000, and relinquish all claims to Carlos's retirement accounts and future income from his architectural firm. He thinks I'll just roll over and disappear, I told Gianna during our follow-up meeting on Thursday afternoon, like I'm some inconvenient obstacle to his happiness. It's a standard intimidation tactic, she replied, setting the proposal aside, without a second glance. An insulting first offer designed to establish dominance. We'll respond appropriately. But it was what came next that truly changed everything. Friday evening, I was organizing patient files in my office at Denver Children's when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Hank Miller, Jenny's husband. Gabby? It's Hank. I have something you need to see. Can you meet me? His voice sounded strained, urgent in a way that made me sit up straighter. I'm just finishing at the hospital. Where? The coffee shop across from your mom's house in half an hour? And maybe bring Tony. I called Tony immediately, who agreed to meet us there. Don't go alone, he advised. Not because of Hank, but because whatever he has might need proper documentation. Riverbank Coffee was nearly empty when I arrived, the evening rush long past. Hank sat in a corner booth, hunched over a laptop, looking thinner than when I'd last seen him 3 months earlier. At 40, he'd always been boyishly handsome in a professor next door way, with wire-rimmed glasses and perpetually tousled brown hair. Now, he looked haunted, the strain of recent events etched into the new lines around his eyes. Thanks for coming, he said, standing briefly as Tony and I slid into the booth opposite him. You said you have something to show me? I prompted, accepting the coffee he'd already ordered for me. He remembered how I took it, with cinnamon and a splash of almond milk. Hank nodded, turning his laptop toward us. I was clearing out our home office last weekend, getting ready to sell the house, when I found Jenny's old external hard drive. It wasn't password protected. He clicked open a folder labeled C&J Plans. At first I thought it was just work stuff, client plans for Carlos's firm. But then I saw this. He opened a document titled Exit Strategy Final.docx. The timestamp showed it had been created in April, 7 months ago, well before I'd noticed. Any suspicious behavior? The document was meticulous, detailed in a way that made my stomach clench. It outlined a comprehensive plan for Carlos and Jenny to extract themselves from their respective marriages while maximizing financial benefits and minimizing legal consequences. Point by point, it laid out a timeline. April-May. Carlos begins. Transferring small amounts to private account June-July. Jenny prepares Hank for separation discussion, citing growing apart. August. Carlos increases work hours to establish pattern of absence. September. Jenny initiates separation from Hank. Moves to temporary apartment October. Wait for G's family situation to resolve. November. Carlos leaves G. Financial extraction complete. There were subsections detailing which assets to liquidate first, which to protect through legal means, and how to manage the narrative of their relationship to minimize social fallout. Most chilling was a section titled G Considerations. G's emotional attachment to Carlos will make her vulnerable to quick settlement. Use her focus on father's health situation to advantage. Suggest generous-seeming but actually minimal settlement during period of grief. Emphasize fresh start and clean break narratives. I read the document twice, my nurse's training keeping. My hands steady even as rage built inside me. This wasn't just an affair that had happened. This was a calculated, months-long conspiracy to dismantle 2 marriages while extracting maximum financial benefit. There's more, Hank said quietly, opening another folder labeled Property Division. Inside were spreadsheets detailing every asset from both marriages, with columns marking items as high priority or concession possible. Our condo was listed as priority, significant equity growth potential. My retirement account was categorized as small but accessible, target. For early settlement, most stunning was the note beside my grandmother's engagement ring, which I'd left in our safe deposit box. Vintage platinum setting, significant resale value. They had planned to take my family heirloom and sell it. Tony was photographing each screen methodically, his detective training evident in his systematic approach. This is exceptional evidence, he said finally. Premeditation, conspiracy, financial strategy. Why are you showing us this? I asked Hank, studying his face. You could have used it in your own divorce proceedings first. Hank removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose wearily. 2 reasons. First, you were my friend too, Gabby. For 9 years. What they did to you, planning around your father's illness, targeting that ring, it's unconscionable. He hesitated, then continued. Second, there's something you should know about Carlos's firm. They're under investigation by the state licensing board for code violations on 3 major projects. Carlos knew this was coming. It's part of why he accelerated their timeline. If the firm faces serious penalties, it could impact the value of his partnership significantly. He was planning to cash out before the scandal broke, Tony realized aloud. Exactly, Hank confirmed. Jenny mentioned it in one of her voice memos. She accidentally synced them to our shared cloud account. He played a recording dated just 3 weeks ago. Jenny's voice filled the quiet coffee shop. Carlos says we need to finalize everything before the board hearing in December. Once the violations go public, his partnership stake could lose half its value. The Peterson building's foundation issues are worse than anyone knows. The whole project might get shut down for months. I sat back, processing this new information. Carlos hadn't just betrayed me emotionally. He'd been planning to shield his assets from both me and his professional liabilities. "The Peterson building," I repeated slowly. "That's the new pediatric specialty center they're building next to my hospital." Hank nodded grimly. "The same one. Apparently there are serious structural concerns they concealed from inspectors." The full picture was finally coming into focus. Not just a betrayal of marriage vows, but a comprehensive scheme involving professional ethics violations, financial manipulation, and the coldly calculated exploitation of my father's illness and death. "Hank," I said, reaching across the table to touch his hand briefly, "thank you for this. I know it couldn't have been easy." He gave a sad smile. "Jenny and I were together for 12 years. I thought I knew her. Finding this, realizing the person I loved was capable of such calculated cruelty, it changes how you see everything." I nodded, understanding completely. The Jenny I'd known, or thought I'd known, had held my hand through nursing school exams, had helped me pick out my wedding dress, had brought homemade soup when I caught pneumonia 3 years ago. Reconciling that person with the woman who had plotted to exploit my grief seemed impossible. "What will you do now?" I asked him. "Finalize my divorce as quickly and cleanly as possible. I've accepted a teaching position at UCLA starting next semester." He closed his laptop carefully. "I need a fresh start somewhere far from here." As Hank left, Tony and I remained in the booth, the evidence copied and secured on his phone. "This changes everything," he said. "Gianna needs to see this immediately." I nodded, a strange calm settling over me. The shock and pain of the original betrayal had been devastating, but this revelation, the cold, calculated nature of their conspiracy, had an oddly clarifying effect. "They didn't just fall in love and make a bad decision," I said quietly. "They sat down and planned how to hurt us both for maximum benefit." "Yes," Tony agreed. "And now we know exactly who we're dealing with." The following Monday morning found me sitting in Gianna Martinez's office, watching her methodically review the evidence Hank had provided. Tony sat beside me, occasionally adding context or highlighting specific details as Gianna scrolled through the documents. "In 15 years of family law," she said finally, looking up from her computer, "I've rarely seen something this calculating. They didn't just have an affair, they created a business plan for it." "What does this mean for our approach?" I asked, absently touching my grandmother's sapphire ring for reassurance, a habit I'd developed over the past week. Gianna closed her laptop decisively. "It means we shift from defense to offense. Until now, we've been focused on protecting your assets and establishing boundaries. With this evidence, we move toward full financial discovery and potentially pursue claims of fraud and conspiracy." She pulled out a legal pad, writing in crisp, precise handwriting. "First, we file an amended petition citing fraud, conspiracy, to defraud, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Second, we request emergency discovery regarding Carlos's firm and the Peterson building project. Third, we notify the state licensing board about potential evidence relevant to their investigation." "Will that last part help my case?" I asked. "Indirectly," Gianna confirmed. "It establishes a pattern of deceptive behavior that extends beyond your marriage. Judges take note when they see consistency in character, or lack thereof." Tony leaned forward. "We should also consider how this affects asset division. If Carlos was trying to shield himself from professional liability, that's another layer of financial misconduct." Gianna nodded, adding another note. "We'll request a forensic accounting of all business interests. The timeline matches too perfectly to be coincidental." As they discussed legal strategies, I found myself thinking about my patients at the hospital, particularly 16-year-old Zoe, who was battling an aggressive form of leukemia. Yesterday, she'd asked me why I seemed distracted during her treatment. "Adult problems," I'd told her with a smile. "Nothing for you to worry about." She'd fixed me with that preternatural wisdom that seriously ill teenagers often develop. "You Know what my mom says about problems, Nurse Gabby? She says you can either let them crush you or use them to build something stronger. That simple wisdom had stayed with me. This betrayal could crush me, or I could use it to build something stronger. Not just in my legal case, but in my life moving forward. Gabby? Gianna's voice pulled me back to the present. Are you comfortable with this approach? It will be more confrontational than what we originally discussed. I straightened in my chair. Yes, they made this confrontational when they plotted around my father's illness. I'm not seeking revenge, but I won't be exploited either. Good, she replied, handing me several documents to sign. Because Wells just delivered their formal response to our initial filing. They're claiming that Carlos's note was written under emotional duress, that the money transfers were for a surprise anniversary gift, and that he only moved out after you allegedly became unstable with grief. The audacity was breathtaking. They're using my father's death to paint me as emotionally unbalanced. It's a common tactic, Gianna explained. Make the injured party seem unreasonable. However, she smiled slightly, tapping the evidence from Hank. They clearly weren't expecting this. For the next hour, we developed a comprehensive action plan. By week's end, Gianna would file the amended petition and emergency motions. Tony would coordinate with Amy Rhodes, the forensic accountant, to begin tracing the financial trail through Carlos's various accounts. I would gather additional documentation about the Peterson Building project from colleagues at the hospital who had been involved in the planning. What about Jenny? I asked as we wrapped up. Her role in all this is clear from the evidence. Legally, our case is against Carlos, Gianna clarified. However, the conspiracy evidence strengthens our position considerably, and nothing prevents Hank from using the same evidence in his divorce proceedings. As we left Gianna's office, Tony suggested we make one more stop. We should visit the Peterson Building site, see firsthand what they were trying to hide. The construction site occupied a full block adjacent to Denver Children's Hospital, what would eventually become a specialized outpatient center for pediatric chronic conditions. Yellow bulldozers and cranes stood idle against the cloudy October sky, a chain-link fence surrounding the partially completed structure. Tony flashed his private investigator credentials to the security guard, explaining we needed to document the site for potential legal proceedings. The guard, bored and underpaid, waved us through with minimal interest. What exactly are we looking for? I asked as we walked the perimeter of the foundation. I'm not sure, Tony admitted. But sometimes seeing things in person provides context that documents can't. We circled the massive concrete foundation, now clearly abandoned mid-construction. Yellow caution tape fluttered around several large support pillars, and engineering markers showed recent inspection points. Carlos's firm designed this? Tony asked, examining what appeared to be stress fractures in one massive support column. They were the lead architects, I confirmed. The hospital board selected them because of their history with healthcare facilities. Carlos led the project personally. It was supposed to be his masterpiece. A voice called from behind us. Can I help you folks? We turned to find a middle-aged man in a hard hat and safety vest approaching. His badge identified him as Matthew Jacobson, site engineering supervisor. Tony again explained our presence, showing his credentials. The supervisor's face changed when he heard Carlos's name. Vasquez, from Landmark Architectural? His expression darkened. That man has a lot to answer for. We're gathering information related to a legal matter, Tony said carefully. Anything you could tell us about the project would be helpful. Matthew hesitated, then gestured for us to follow him to a small trailer serving as the site office. Inside, blueprints covered a folding table, red marks highlighting various sections of the foundation. This was supposed to be my retirement project, he said, spreading out the most recent plans. 30 years in engineering, ending with a state-of-the-art pediatric facility. Instead, I'm fighting to save my professional license. He pointed to several sections marked with angry red circles. These support columns weren't built to specification. The concrete mixture was diluted to save costs, about 30% below the required strength for a structure this size. That's dangerous, Tony observed. Catastrophically so, Matthew confirmed grimly. In a serious earthquake or even heavy snow load, we could have seen a progressive collapse. We're talking about a building that would have held sick children. I felt physically ill imagining what could have happened. The patients and families I work with every day, trapped in a collapsing structure. When was this discovered? I asked. An anonymous whistleblower sent core sample results to the licensing board in September. They ordered emergency testing, which confirmed everything. He shook his head in disgust. By then, Vasquez and his senior partners had already started distancing themselves from the project, blaming the contractors and engineering team. September, exactly when Carlos and Jenny had accelerated their exit strategy. Would you be willing to provide a statement about this? Tony asked. For a legal proceeding that might be tangentially related? Matthew considered this. If it helps hold the right people accountable, absolutely. As we left the construction site, pieces were falling into place with disturbing clarity. Carlos hadn't just betrayed me personally. He'd been involved in a professional ethical breach that could have endangered children's lives. His rush to liquidate assets and shield himself behind a quick divorce settlement suddenly made perfect sense. We need to tell Gianna about this immediately, Tony said as we returned to his car. It's not just about your divorce anymore. This is part of a much larger pattern of deception. I nodded, still processing the implications. He was willing to risk children's safety for profit, then run away, before facing consequences. What kind of person did I marry? The question hung in the air between us, unanswerable and haunting. The Carlos I thought I knew, the dedicated architect with exacting standards, the man who'd spent hours perfecting our home's renovation plans, seemed to have never existed at all. Someone who underestimated you completely, Tony finally replied. And that's going to be his biggest mistake. The emergency hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning at the Denver County Courthouse, a towering structure of limestone and granite that had witnessed thousands of marriages being formed and dissolved within its solemn chambers. I arrived early with Gianna and Tony, dressed in a simple navy blue suit that my mother had helped me select the night before. Professional but not flashy, she'd advised while hemming the pants in her living room. You want to look like exactly what you are, a respected medical professional who's been wronged but isn't seeking drama. As we settled at the plaintiff's table in courtroom 3B, I tried to calm my racing heart. Despite years of handling medical emergencies, despite facing parents during their worst moments as I delivered difficult news about their children, nothing had prepared me for seeing Carlos in a legal setting. He arrived 10 minutes before the scheduled time, flanked by Bradford Wells and another attorney I didn't recognize. Carlos looked polished in a charcoal gray suit I'd never seen before, his dark hair freshly cut, his expression carefully neutral. Our eyes met briefly across the room before he quickly looked away, leaning to whisper something to his attorney. Remember, Gianna murmured beside me, let me do the talking unless directly addressed by Judge Wilson. No matter what they claim, maintain your composure. Judge Elaine Wilson entered promptly at 9 a.m., a formidable woman in her 60s with silver hair and penetrating eyes that seemed to evaluate everyone in the room simultaneously. After reviewing the case title, she addressed the attorneys directly. Counselors, I've reviewed the emergency motions filed by both parties. Ms. Martinez is seeking an injunction against removal of marital assets and expanded financial discovery, based on new evidence. Mr. Wells is seeking normalized access to the condominium and an expedited settlement conference. Let's begin with the plaintiff's motion. Gianna rose smoothly, her burgundy suit a stark contrast to the polished wood of the courtroom. Your Honor, we have recently obtained evidence of a coordinated and premeditated plan to defraud my client of her rightful share of marital assets. This wasn't simply a marriage that deteriorated. It was a calculated conspiracy between Mr. Vasquez and a third party to exploit Mrs. Vasquez's vulnerability during her father's illness and subsequent death. She presented the court with copies of the exit strategy document and financial spreadsheets from Jenny's hard drive, highlighting the timeline that specifically targeted my father's illness as an opportunity. Furthermore, Gianna continued, we have evidence suggesting Mr. Vasquez was attempting to shield assets not only from the marital estate, but potentially from professional liability related to serious structural defects in the Peterson Pediatric Center project, which is currently under investigation by the state licensing board. Bradford Wells sprang to his feet, his face flushed. Objection, Your Honor. This is outrageous speculation intended to smear my client's professional reputation. The Peterson project has absolutely nothing to do with this divorce proceeding. Judge Wilson examined the documents before her. I'll reserve judgment on the relevance of the professional matters. Continue, Ms. Martinez. For the next 20 minutes, Gianna methodically presented our evidence. The bank records showing systematic transfers, the documented timeline matching exactly with the exit strategy, and the voice recording mentioning the Peterson building's structural issues. When it was Wells's turn, he attempted to paint a completely different picture. Your Honor, what we have here is unfortunately common in divorce cases: a spouse unable to accept the end of a marriage, who has constructed elaborate conspiracies to justify their feelings of abandonment. He gestured toward me with theatrical sympathy. Mrs. Vasquez recently lost her father, a traumatic event for anyone. During this period of intense grief, she has misinterpreted normal financial management and the natural end of a marriage as some grand conspiracy. My client acknowledges that his timing in leaving the marriage was insensitive, but grief has transformed an unfortunate situation into something it simply isn't. His characterization of me as an emotionally unstable, grief-stricken woman inventing conspiracies made my blood boil, but I maintained the composed expression I'd perfected during difficult patient consultations. And these documents? Judge Wilson asked, holding up the evidence Gianna had presented. The detailed exit strategy, with specific references to Mrs. Vasquez's father's health? Wells cleared his throat. Your Honor, we have not had time to properly examine these alleged documents. They appeared suddenly, supposedly from the estranged husband of the woman my client is now seeing. Their authenticity is highly questionable, possibly fabricated by two angry exes collaborating. Judge Wilson raised an eyebrow. Are you formally challenging the authenticity of these documents, Mr. Wells? We reserve the right to do so after proper examination, Your Honor. The judge turned to Carlos. Mr. Vasquez, please approach the bench. Carlos walked forward, his usual confident stride slightly hesitant. Mr. Vasquez, are you familiar with a document titled Exit Strategy Final that outlines plans for leaving your marriage? Carlos glanced at his attorney before answering. Your Honor, I'm aware that my friend Jenny created some documents to help organize her thoughts during a difficult time. I may have seen them, but I didn't create them or necessarily agree with everything in them. So you acknowledge these documents exist and you've seen them? Carlos shifted uncomfortably. Some version of them, yes, but... And did you transfer approximately $27,000 from joint accounts to a private account in the months preceding your separation? I was simply reorganizing our investments, Your Honor. Those funds were intended for... Judge Wilson cut him off. Mr. Vasquez, please answer yes or no. Did you transfer these funds without informing your wife? Carlos's jaw tightened. Yes. And did you inform Mrs. Vasquez of your intention to end your marriage via a note left on her vehicle during her father's funeral? Carlos paled visibly. Yes. It was a terrible lapse in judgment that I deeply regret. Judge Wilson studied him for a long moment before saying, You may return to your seat, Mr. Vasquez. After Carlos sat down, the judge reviewed the documents once more before delivering her ruling. Based on the evidence presented, I'm granting the plaintiff's motion for expanded financial discovery. Mr. Vasquez will provide complete documentation of all accounts, investments, and business interests within 10 days. The temporary restraining order regarding marital assets will remain in effect until further notice. She turned to address Wells's motion. Regarding access to the condominium, Mr. Vasquez may retrieve additional personal belongings under supervision, with an itemized list provided 48 hours in advance. All items removed must be documented and photographed. Wells attempted to interject, but Judge Wilson silenced him with a raised hand. Furthermore, she continued, I find the timing and method of Mr. Vasquez's departure from the marriage to be troubling. Leaving a note during a funeral shows, at minimum, a disturbing lack of empathy. Combined with the financial transfers and documented planning, there is sufficient cause for concern about potential fraud against the marital estate. She fixed Carlos with a stern look. Mr. Vasquez, this court takes a very dim view of attempts to hide assets or exploit vulnerability. I strongly suggest you approach the remainder of these proceedings with complete transparency. As the hearing concluded, I felt a complex mix of validation and exhaustion. Gianna gathered our materials, looking pleased with the outcome. That went better than expected, she whispered. Judge Wilson is known for her thoroughness. Once she's suspicious, she doesn't let go. As we prepared to leave, Carlos approached our table, ignoring his attorney's attempt to stop him. Gabby, he said quietly, using my nickname for the first time since the note. Can we talk? Just for a minute? Tony moved closer protectively, but I nodded for him to give us space. What could you possibly have to say to me, Carlos? I asked, keeping my voice steady. His perfectly practiced expression cracked slightly, revealing something that might have been genuine regret. This isn't what I wanted. Things have gotten out of hand. Things haven't gotten anywhere, Carlos. You planned this, executed it, and are now facing the consequences. You don't understand. The Peterson Project. I understand perfectly, I interrupted. You cut corners on a building meant for sick children, and when it was about to come crashing down around you, you decided to cut corners on our marriage too. His face hardened. You have no idea what you're talking about. The Peterson situation is complicated. Endangering children isn't complicated. It's unconscionable. I gathered my purse, preparing to walk away, and so was leaving your wife a note during her father's funeral. As I turned to leave, Carlos grabbed my arm. Gabby, wait. Tony stepped forward immediately, his voice low, but firm. Remove your hand, Carlos, now. Carlos released me, his face flushing with anger or embarrassment, perhaps both. This isn't over, he said, almost under his breath. You're right about that, I replied, meeting his gaze directly for the first time. It's just beginning. The courthouse steps felt symbolic as I descended them that Thursday afternoon, each step taking me further from the woman who had received that devastating note and closer to someone stronger, more determined. Tony walked beside me, occasionally glancing back to ensure Carlos and his legal team weren't following. You did great in there, he said as we reached the parking lot. Judge Wilson clearly saw through their attempt to paint you as emotionally unstable. It helped that Carlos confirmed everything, I replied, breathing in the crisp autumn air. I don't think his attorney expected him to admit to seeing the exit strategy document. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. How did it go? Followed by 3 prayer hand emojis. She'd wanted to attend the hearing, but had a follow-up appointment with my father's cardiologist, a painful reminder of the medical bills that had begun arriving with relentless frequency. As we drove away from the courthouse, Tony outlined next steps. Amy Rhodes will start the forensic accounting tomorrow. Gianna wants to depose Jenny next week, get her on record about the planning documents. I nodded, watching Denver's skyline recede in the side mirror. What about the Peterson building information? Will that really help our case? Indirectly, but significantly, Tony confirmed. It establishes a pattern of deceptive behavior and explains the urgency behind their timeline. Judges aren't supposed to consider character in divorce proceedings, but they're human. When they see someone who endangers children and abandons their spouse during a funeral, it colors everything. The mention of children brought my thoughts back to the hospital. I'd taken a week of emergency family leave following my father's death, but was scheduled to return on Monday. My young patients, many, facing life-threatening illnesses, provided perspective that no divorce proceeding could overshadow. "I need to prepare for work," I said as Tony pulled up to my mother's house. "Can we continue this tomorrow?" "Of course," he agreed. "Take the evening to decompress. Today was a win, Gabby." Inside, I found my mother at the kitchen table, surrounded by medical statements and insurance forms. Her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose as she methodically entered figures into a spreadsheet. A skill she'd developed over decades of managing household finances while my father handled emotional crises at the high school. "The hearing went well," I told her, kissing the top of her head before settling into the chair opposite. "Judge Wilson granted everything Gianna requested." She removed her glasses, studying my face. "And how are you feeling?" "Validated," I said after a moment's consideration. For months, I thought I was being paranoid, overreacting to normal marital changes. Now there's documented proof that it was all calculated. My mother nodded, a familiar determined expression crossing her face. "Your father always said the truth has a weight to it, a substance that lies lack. Once you hold it in your hands, you know the difference." We shared a sad smile at the mention of my father. 6 weeks after his death, the ache remained constant. But we'd developed a ritual of sharing his wisdom as a way of keeping him present. "I miss him," I said simply. "Every minute," she agreed, squeezing my hand briefly before returning to the medical bills. "Oh, before I forget, Hank called while you were in court. He's stopping by around 7 to drop off some things he found that belonged to you." At precisely 7 o'clock, Hank arrived carrying a cardboard box labeled "Gabby's Stuff" in Jenny's distinctive handwriting. His normally neat appearance had deteriorated since our coffee shop meeting. His button-down shirt wrinkled, his hair uncombed. "Sorry to interrupt your evening," he said as my mother ushered him into the living room. "I'm finishing the house clean-out this weekend and found these in Jenny's office." The box contained an odd assortment of items from our long friendship. Photo albums from nursing school, birthday cards I'd sent her over the years, several books I'd loaned her and forgotten about. At the bottom lay a smaller box. Inside was my old hospital ID badge from Chicago Memorial, where Jenny and I had first met when she was doing the interior design for the new oncology wing. "I was just the coffee girl," Hank said, noticing my expression as I held the badge. "That's how we met. I was working at the hospital coffee cart while finishing my master's thesis. Jenny came in with you one day, complaining about some contractor who'd installed the wrong lighting fixtures. I remembered that day. Jenny fiercely advocating for proper lighting in patient rooms, insisting that healing environments mattered. That passion for creating spaces that helped people heal had been what drew me to her initially." "She was different then," Hank said quietly, as though reading my thoughts. "We both were." My mother tactfully excused herself to make coffee, leaving us alone with the physical remnants of relationships that no longer existed. "How's the divorce proceeding on your end?" I asked, carefully replacing the badge in its box. Hank sighed, heavily. "Faster than expected. The evidence from the hard drive. Jenny's attorney advised her to settle quickly rather than fight. We sign final papers next Tuesday." "That's good, I guess?" "Efficient," he corrected with a sad smile. "Not sure anything about this situation qualifies as good." He hesitated before continuing. "There's something else you should know. Jenny's pregnant." The revelation hit like a physical blow. "Carlos's?" Hank nodded, his expression unreadable. "About 3 months along, according to her attorney. She apparently disclosed it during discovery to explain certain medical expenses. 3 months. which meant the pregnancy had begun while both marriages were intact, while my father was still alive, while Carlos was still coming home to me each night pretending everything was normal. "I'm sorry," Hank said, watching my face carefully. "I thought you should hear it from someone who cares about you, not in a legal document." My mind raced through calculations, the timeline, the implications, the sudden urgency behind their exit strategy. A baby would change everything about the divorce proceedings. "Thank you for telling me," I managed finally. "I appreciate your honesty." After Hank left, I called Tony immediately, relaying the new information. His sharp intake of breath confirmed my suspicions about its significance. "This explains a lot," he said. "The accelerated timeline, Jenny pushing back on waiting until after your father's situation resolved. How does this affect our case?" I asked, pacing my childhood bedroom where I'd retreated for privacy. "Technically, it shouldn't. The child was conceived during your marriage, but Colorado courts don't typically factor infidelity into asset division. Practically, though," he paused, "it provides context for their rush and explains why Carlos might fight harder for certain assets." "He's going to be a father," I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. The Carlos I'd known had been ambivalent about children, citing our busy careers and the freedom of our child-free lifestyle whenever the subject arose. "Gabby," Tony's voice softened, "are you okay?" I considered the question honestly. The pregnancy? Revelation should have devastated me. The ultimate betrayal. The family Carlos had refused to start with me. Instead, I felt an odd clarity, as though the final piece of a puzzle had clicked into place. "I'm okay," I said, surprising myself with the truth of it. "It hurts, but it also explains everything. They weren't just having an affair, they were starting a new life that had no room for their old ones." After ending the call, I sat on my bed, processing this latest development. Outside my window, the maple tree my father had planted when I was born shed its crimson leaves against the darkening sky. A reminder that endings and beginnings were often indistinguishable from each other. My phone buzzed with an incoming text. To my surprise, it was from Jenny. "Hank told me he spoke with you. I know nothing I can say will make this right. I never meant for any of this to happen this way." I stared at the message, considering whether to respond. The Jenny I'd known, my maid of honor, my confidant through nursing school, deserved a response. The woman who had plotted around my father's illness while carrying my husband's child did not. I set the phone aside without replying. Some bridges couldn't be rebuilt once burned, and perhaps shouldn't be. Tomorrow would bring new legal strategies, work responsibilities, and the continuing process of rebuilding my life from the ground up. But tonight, surrounded by the evidence of relationships irrevocably changed, I allowed myself to grieve not just for my father, but for the future I'd thought was certain. The following 6 weeks passed in a blur of legal meetings, hospital shifts, and quiet evenings spent with my mother, gradually sorting through my father's belongings. November brought the first snowfall to Denver, transforming the city into a quiet, white landscape that seemed to mute the chaos of recent events. My return to work had been both challenging and therapeutic. My young oncology patients didn't care about my personal drama. They needed my focus, my compassion, and my medical expertise. 14-year-old Zoe had completed her final round of chemotherapy and was showing promising signs of remission. 10-year-old Marcus had been cleared for a bone marrow transplant after months of waiting for a match. 7-year-old Lily had celebrated her birthday in the oncology ward, her bald head adorned with a tiara as we all sang to her. These small victories and ongoing battles provided perspective that no divorce proceeding could diminish. The legal process, meanwhile, had taken several unexpected turns. After Jenny's pregnancy was formally disclosed in court documents, Carlos's approach had shifted dramatically. Gone was the contrite husband who had attempted to speak with me after the emergency hearing. In his place was an aggressive litigant, determined to secure his financial future for his new family. It's actually making our case stronger, Gianna explained during our mid-November meeting. His transparent attempt to shield assets is backfiring. Judge Wilson has approved our request for comprehensive financial discovery, including Carlos's partnership agreement and projected future earnings. The forensic accountant, Amy Rhodes, had uncovered 3 additional accounts Carlos had opened in the past year, containing nearly $125,000 in diverted funds. Most significantly, she discovered that Carlos had quietly sold his share in a small, commercial property in Boulder, a property purchased with an inheritance I'd received from my grandmother 5 years earlier. That's clearly marital fraud, Gianna had explained, adding it to her growing file of evidence. Selling jointly owned property without consent and hiding the proceeds is exactly what judges look for when determining if someone has acted in bad faith. The Peterson Building investigation had also escalated. The state licensing board had scheduled formal hearings for early December, with Carlos named as one of the primary respondents. Matthew Jacobson, the site engineer, had provided a detailed statement confirming that Carlos had personally approved changes to the concrete specifications, despite being warned about potential safety issues. All of these developments led to today, December 10th, and the final divorce hearing that would formally end my 9-year marriage to Carlos Vasquez. The courtroom was more crowded than I expected for a Tuesday morning. Tony sat directly behind me, along with my mother and 2 nurses from my hospital unit who had taken personal time to support me. Carlos sat at the defense table with Bradford Wells, looking tired and strained in the same charcoal suit he'd worn to the emergency hearing. Jenny was noticeably absent, though Hank had mentioned she was now showing visibly approaching her 5th month of pregnancy. Judge Wilson entered precisely at 9:00 a.m., her silver hair swept into a neat bun, her expression as impassive as during our first appearance. After calling the court to order, she addressed both attorneys. "Counselors, I understand you've reached a settlement agreement after mediation. Is that correct?" Gianna rose first. "Yes, Your Honor. After reviewing the financial discovery and evaluating the evidence of asset concealment, we've developed a comprehensive settlement that addresses both past actions and future considerations." Bradford Wells stood as well, his earlier aggressive demeanor noticeably subdued. "That's correct, Your Honor. While my client disputes certain characterizations of his actions, we have agreed to terms that both parties can accept." Judge Wilson nodded. "I've reviewed the proposed settlement. Before approving it, I'd like to address both parties directly." She turned to me first. "Mrs. Morales, you've reverted to your maiden name in these proceedings. Is that your intention going forward?" "Yes, Your Honor," I replied, my voice steady despite the formality of the moment. "I've already begun the process of legally changing my name back to Morales." "Very well." She made a note before continuing. "And you've reviewed the settlement agreement in detail? You understand that it provides you with 70% of the marital assets, full ownership of the condominium, your complete retirement accounts, and a portion of Mr. Vasquez's partnership proceeds for the next 5 years?" "I have, Your Honor." She turned to Carlos. "Mr. Vasquez, you've agreed to these terms despite your attorney's initial position that assets should be divided equally. Can you confirm for the record that you're entering this agreement voluntarily?" Carlos cleared his throat. "Yes, Your Honor." "And you understand that this agreement includes penalties for any additional assets discovered after today's proceeding?" A muscle twitched in Carlos's jaw. "I do." Judge Wilson studied both of us for a long moment before continuing. "I've been presiding over divorce cases for 17 years. In that time, I've developed a sense for when parties are being forthright and when they're attempting to manipulate the process." She fixed Carlos with a penetrating stare. "Mr. Vasquez, the evidence presented in this case suggests a pattern of deliberate financial concealment and emotional manipulation. The fact that you chose to abandon your marriage via a note during Mrs. Morales' father's funeral shows a disturbing lack of basic human decency." Carlos looked down at the table, unable to meet her gaze. "While I cannot legally consider infidelity, In dividing assets, I can and do consider attempts to defraud the marital estate. She tapped the thick file before her. The documented timeline of your actions, the hidden accounts discovered during forensic accounting, and the sale of jointly owned property without consent all demonstrate bad faith negotiation. She turned to me, her expression softening slightly. Mrs. Morales, I commend your composure throughout these proceedings. Despite significant emotional provocation, you've maintained focus on equitable resolution rather than punitive action. Judge Wilson signed the settlement document with a flourish. The court approves the settlement as presented. Per Colorado law, your marriage is dissolved effective immediately. With the strike of her gavel, 9 years of marriage ended officially. The sound reverberated through the courtroom, marking the formal conclusion of a relationship that had, in truth, ended months ago in a funeral home parking lot. As we gathered our belongings, Carlos approached our table, ignoring Wells's attempt to steer him toward the exit. "Gabby," he said quietly, "can we speak privately for a moment?" Tony moved closer protectively, but I nodded for him to give us space. This would be the last conversation I had with the man I had once planned to grow old with. It deserved a moment of privacy. We stepped into an alcove near the courtroom entrance, far enough from others to speak without being overheard. "I know you hate me," Carlos began, his voice low and tense. "You have every right to." "I don't hate you, Carlos," I replied truthfully. "I don't recognize you. The man I married would never have endangered children with substandard building materials. He wouldn't have plotted around a dying man's illness. He wouldn't have left his wife a note during a funeral." Carlos flinched visibly at each statement. "I got lost somewhere," he said after a moment. "The partnership, the pressure, that's not an excuse, just a reality I didn't handle well." "And Jenny? The baby?" His expression changed, softening in a way I'd once found endearing. "That's real. Whatever else happened, however wrong our actions were, that's real." I nodded, understanding despite myself. In Carlos's mind, the end justified the means. His new family somehow validated the deception required to create it. "I hope you'll be a better husband and father than you were to me," I said finally. "That child deserves better than what I got." Carlos looked as though he wanted to say more, but instead simply nodded. "The Peterson investigation. I've submitted my resignation from the firm and am cooperating with the licensing board. I wanted you to know that." "Too late to undo the damage, but better than nothing," I acknowledged. As he turned to leave, Carlos paused. "I am sorry, Gabby. Not just for getting caught, but for who I became. You deserved better." I watched him walk away, carrying the settlement that had cost him most of his liquid assets, but preserved just enough for him to start his new life with Jenny and their child. His shoulders were hunched slightly, the posture of someone carrying a burden he'd created himself. Back in the main hallway, my mother embraced me tightly. "It's done, mija. Now you can truly begin again." As we left the courthouse, I felt the December sunlight on my face, bright despite the cold, promising that even winter eventually yields to spring. The divorce proceedings had consumed nearly 2 months of my life, but standing on those courthouse steps as Gabriela Morales once again, I felt something unexpected. Possibility. "What now?" Tony asked as we descended the steps. "Now," I said, breathing deeply, "I start building something new." The weeks following the divorce finalization unfolded, with surprising tranquility. December's holiday season, which I had dreaded facing as a newly single woman, instead brought unexpected moments of peace and connection. My mother and I established new traditions to fill the void left by my father's absence. Instead of our usual Christmas Eve dinner at my parents' home, we volunteered at the Children's Hospital, bringing small gifts and comfort to families spending the holidays in sterile hospital rooms. Seeing the resilience of my young patients and their parents, many facing far greater challenges than mine, provided perspective that no self-help book could offer. "You seem different," my colleague Jenny, a different Jenny, the charge nurse, on our oncology unit, commented one evening as we finished our shift notes. "More present, somehow." I considered her observation as we walked to the staff parking lot. "I think I am. When you're constantly scanning for signs of deception, you miss what's right in front of you. Now I don't have to do that anymore." The condominium that had once felt tainted by betrayal gradually transformed as I reclaimed the space. Carlos had collected his approved belongings under supervision in late December. A tense 2 hours during which he'd said little, methodically, packing clothing, books, and personal mementos while a court-appointed observer documented each item. With Carlos's modern, minimalist furniture gone, I was free to create a home that reflected my own tastes. I painted the stark white walls with warm colors, replaced the uncomfortable designer sofa with a plush sectional perfect for reading, and filled empty shelves with books I'd kept in storage during my marriage. My mother's artistic touch added hand-embroidered pillows and family photos in mismatched frames, elements Carlos had always dismissed as cluttered. "This place finally feels like you," Tony remarked during his January visit to install a new security system. His insistence, though I no longer felt threatened by Carlos's potential return. Financially, the settlement provided stability I hadn't expected. The forensic accountant had uncovered enough hidden assets to strengthen my position significantly. After paying Gianna's legal fees, I still had sufficient funds to establish an emergency reserve and make modest investments for the future. Most importantly, I could help my mother with my father's outstanding medical bills, a burden that had weighed heavily on both of us. Professional consequences caught up with Carlos in early January, when the state licensing board formally censured him and 4 other partners from his firm for the Peterson building violations. The local business journal published a detailed account of the substandard materials and falsified safety reports, ending with the news that Carlos had surrendered his architectural license for 2 years. I learned these details not from following the case but from Matthew Jacobson, the site engineer who had become an unexpected ally. He'd stopped by the hospital to thank me for my role in bringing the violations to light. "The Pediatric Center project has been reassigned to a new firm," he explained over coffee in the hospital cafeteria. "They're starting from scratch, properly, this time. Children will be safe because you spoke up." "I was just protecting myself," I admitted. "The building safety issues were secondary to my divorce case." Matthew shook his head. "Intentions matter less than action sometimes. Either way, you helped prevent a potential tragedy." News about Carlos and Jenny came indirectly through Hank, who had indeed relocated to UCLA for a fresh start. Before leaving Denver, he'd stopped by my mother's house with an unexpected housewarming gift, a hand-carved wooden box he'd made in his workshop. "I needed to create something positive from all this," he'd explained as I admired the intricate pattern on the lid. "Jenny's having a girl," he added after a pause. "Due in April. They've moved to Phoenix, where Carlos has family." I'd felt a strange detachment hearing this news, as though he were describing characters in a film I'd watched long ago, rather than people who had shattered my life just months earlier. The pregnancy that might once have devastated me now seemed like a distant echo, relevant only as the catalyst that had revealed Carlos's true character before I'd wasted more years with him. My father's absence remained the most persistent pain, a grief that ambushed me in quiet moments, somehow both dulling and sharpening with time. I found comfort in unexpected places, discovering his handwritten notes in the margins of books. He'd loved hearing his favorite jazz recordings on Sunday mornings as my mother made pancakes, recognizing his expressions in my own face when I caught my reflection in the hospital windows at night. "Grief doesn't shrink," my mother observed one evening as we sorted through his winter clothes for donation. "You just grow larger around it until it no longer occupies all of you." As January turned to February, I found myself standing at a clean edge between past and future. The court proceedings were complete, The financial matters settled. The condominium transformed into my space. The frantic emergency of betrayal and divorce had given way to the quieter challenge of building a new life, one entirely of my own. Design. In the hospital breakroom calendar, I circled a date in late February, the Pediatric Oncology Symposium in Chicago, where I'd been invited to present our unit's latest research on adolescent treatment protocols. It would be my first professional trip as Dr. Gabriela Morales, a small but significant step forward into whatever came next. 1 year after finding Carlos's note on my windshield, I stood at the podium in Denver Memorial Hospital's conference center, addressing a room full of healthcare professionals, social workers, and family advocates. The event, Supporting Children Through Family Crisis, had drawn over 150 attendees from across Colorado. Stability can disappear in an instant, I told the audience, my voice steady and confident in a way it hadn't been a year ago. For children facing serious illness, family disruption creates an additional layer of trauma. As healthcare providers, we need to recognize the signs and create systems that support the whole family unit. In the front row sat my pediatric oncology team, alongside hospital administrators who had enthusiastically supported my proposal for a new program, one that provided counseling resources for families experiencing divorce, death, or other major transitions while caring for seriously ill children. The journey to this moment had begun 6 months earlier during the Chicago Symposium, where I'd reconnected with former colleagues and shared my experiences both professional and personal. A chance conversation with the hospital's chief of psychiatry had sparked an idea. What if we created a specialized support system for families in crisis, bridging the gap between medical treatment and emotional well-being? What had started as a casual discussion had evolved into a formal proposal, a pilot program, and now a full departmental initiative with dedicated funding. My father's legacy as a counselor had merged with my nursing expertise to create something neither of us could have accomplished alone. When personal crisis and medical crisis intersect, I continued, families need more than standard protocols. They need compassionate witnesses who understand that healing happens on multiple levels simultaneously. In the year since my divorce, I had transformed in ways I couldn't have anticipated. The cautious, accommodating woman who had documented her husband's betrayal in secret had become someone who spoke at conferences, initiated programs, and advocated fearlessly for vulnerable patients and their families. My personal life had found a new rhythm as well. I'd moved out of the condominium, too many memories lurked in its corners despite the renovations, and purchased a small craftsman bungalow near City Park. My mother had sold the family home, finding it too empty without my father, and bought a comfortable apartment 10 minutes from my new house. Sunday dinners remained our tradition, now hosted in my bright yellow kitchen with occasionally expanding guest lists. Tony had shifted from divorce investigator to friend, sometimes bringing his teenage daughters to these gatherings. Matthew Jacobson, the engineer from the Peterson building site, had become another regular visitor, our shared experience during the investigation evolving into a friendship built on mutual respect and increasingly frequent coffee meetings. These, remains of my old life, occasionally surfaced like artifacts from another era. Carlos and Jenny had indeed moved to Phoenix, where he'd found work with his uncle's residential construction company, a significant step down from his prestigious partnership. According to Hank, who maintained minimal contact for legal reasons, they had welcomed a daughter in April. Sometimes I wondered about that child, who would grow up never knowing how her parents' relationship began, never suspecting that her existence had been planned on spreadsheets alongside exit strategies. But those thoughts came less frequently now, replaced by more immediate concerns. My patients' needs, my research projects, my growing circle of authentic relationships. The betrayal that had once defined my days had receded into its proper perspective. A painful chapter in a story that continued to unfold in unexpected ways. On a bright spring morning, exactly 18 months after my father's funeral, I stood in the newly completed garden at Denver Children's Hospital, a project I'd helped design as part of our family support initiative. The space was vibrant with colorful flowers, comfortable seating areas, and a small memorial fountain where families could place floating candles to honor loved ones. This healing garden had been inspired by conversations with my young patients about what helped them feel normal during extended hospital stays. Somewhere that doesn't smell like hospital, 14-year-old Zoe had suggested, now in full remission and serving on our patient advisory board. The hospital administration had enthusiastically approved the project, recognizing its therapeutic value. What had begun as a modest proposal had evolved into a comprehensive outdoor space where children could feel sunshine on their faces even during long treatments. As I adjusted a bench placement before the official opening ceremony, I noticed a familiar figure approaching. Dr. Ellis, my father's former colleague and longtime family friend. "Gabby," he greeted me warmly. "Your father would be incredibly proud of what you've created here." "I hope so," I replied, taking in the peaceful space that somehow managed to feel both carefully designed and naturally welcoming. "I know so," Dr. Ellis insisted. "You've transformed something painful into something healing. That was always his specialty, too." His observation lingered with me throughout the opening ceremony, where several of my patients cut the ribbon with oversized scissors, their faces alight with excitement despite the IV poles some still needed. Their parents stood nearby, many of whom had participated in our family support programs during their own periods of crisis. Later that evening, I sat on my porch swing, watching fireflies begin their nightly dance across my small but flourishing garden. The journal in my lap contained notes for the book I'd begun writing, a guide for healthcare professionals supporting families through simultaneous medical and personal crises. Reflecting on the 18-month journey since that devastating note on my windshield, I recognized that the path from betrayal to renewal wasn't a straight line, but a series of unexpected turns, each revealing new aspects of strength I hadn't known I possessed. Carlos's betrayal had been calculated to destroy me financially and emotionally. Instead, it had ultimately freed me to discover capabilities that might have remained dormant in the comfortable but constraining life we'd shared. Jenny's friendship had proven false, but in its absence, I'd developed deeper, more authentic connections with colleagues, neighbors, and even strangers who had become important parts of my reconstituted life. Most significantly, my father's death, the loss I had feared would break me completely, had instead connected me more profoundly to his legacy of compassion and service. The pain hadn't diminished, but its purpose had revealed itself in the programs I'd developed, the families I'd supported, and the professional path I now traveled with confidence. My mother had been right. Grief doesn't shrink. You grow larger, around it until it no longer occupies all of you. The same, I discovered, was true of betrayal. The shock and pain don't necessarily fade completely, but they can be transformed into wisdom that guides you toward something more authentic than what was lost. Sometimes life's most devastating moments aren't endings but redirections. Painful, but necessary course corrections that ultimately lead to where you were meant to be all along. The note that Carlos left, intending to shatter my world during my moment of greatest vulnerability, had instead become the first page of a new and better story. The truest response to cruelty isn't bitterness or retaliation. It's the determination to build something meaningful from the wreckage, something that serves not just your own healing, but extends to others navigating similar paths. This wasn't the life I had planned. It was better. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.